Hey everyone, welcome to another brand new and exciting episode of SAFT Podcast. As you can figure out by now, this is not our normal studio recording setup, which makes it all the more exciting and unique. There are a lot of information to share with you at the end of this episode, so stick around and we have a very exciting conversation in store for you. What makes this episode really unique is the fact that this is our first ever in person guest episode, and it makes it all the more joyful for us to have our very good friend Jacob Cheriyan here with us. Jacob, welcome to SAFT Podcast for the very first time.
Thanks, Jacob. It's interesting we have the same name. I'm Jacob Cheriyan and Jacob Verghese. I'm a big fan of SAFT. I've followed SAFT for some time now. It's really interesting from a group of volunteers to pull off something like this. That's a great achievement. It's one thing to do apologetics. It's another thing to bring apologists together and create something like SAFT. So huge congratulations to you guys. It's also a privilege to do the first in-person podcast.
Guest recording with you.
That's a privilege to do. Thanks so much for inviting me.
And it's we are actually delighted that you accepted this invite, which makes it very special for us. And then again, this is a very Jacob to Jacob interaction as well. This is also one of the advantages of our team being here in Bangalore, that we are able to do these sort of stuff. And this episode, while we are recording it in November, this is coming out to you on the day of Christmas. So we wish you a very, very jolly Christmas, and we hope that the union that we celebrate with God through Christ, Emmanuel, God with us, will also fill your hearts and your homes. So Jacob, let's start off with this episode. So there's a meme coming back to my mind. Wait a minute, who are you? So who are you, Jacob, and what do you do?
I mean, that's a very philosophical question, but I'll just answer some of the basic things. I've been born and brought up in Bangalore. We are originally from Kerala. My mom and dad are from Kerala, but I've been born and brought up here. I'm married to Sitara, and I have a daughter who's 2 years old. Her name is Sasha. I stay in the northern part of Bangalore. And my background is that I did mechanical engineering, and then after that, there was a pull in my heart to do ministry, and I've always been interested in theology, in the bigger questions of life, And so apologetics was like a natural push in that direction. So after my studies, I started doing apologetics full time.
So you shift from mechanical engineering to apologetics. Before this recording, we were discussing about how in India it's a common trend for people to do mechanical engineering or engineering of some sort and then move on to do something else. I have a friend in my university in Christ. He's a PhD scholar in social work. He did his engineering in mechanical or something, and now he's doing his PhD in social work. So it's a very common trend for people to discover themselves. You don't need to read a Jay Shetty book. You go for engineering and you'll discover what your purpose and goal in life is. So was there an aha moment in your life where you felt, oh, this is what I want to do life, this is what I want to invest my time in, like when you realize I want to get into apologetics? Was there an aha moment, or was it something like you can't pin it sort of a situation?
That's an interesting question. I haven't thought about that, but I come to think of it, I feel like there was an aha moment, but it happened later after I joined seminary. So I knew that I didn't want to do engineering because I was bad at engineering in the first place. So I felt like I'm more inclined towards the arts and humanities, and theology is in that, within the humanities.
Right.
And I felt the aha moment came when I was in class once. I was doing my MA in biblical studies. And suddenly this whole thing, like, this is fascinating. Like what I'm studying is so fascinating. Studying biblical culture and the world of the Bible at that time, and how God spoke at that time. It really blew my mind. I can't pinpoint when it was, but it was in one of those classes. And in one sense, that aha moment hasn't left. I've always been interested. It's only grown deeper. The study of God and the understanding of God has only kind of deepened itself and widened itself as the years have gone by.
So in this journey of knowing more apologetics, learning more, one experience that you had was where you got to study at Wycliffe Hall in Oxford University. And that seems to be that's very exciting to hear itself. So how was that, and what did you do at Wycliffe Hall? What was your focus there?
Yeah, before going to Wycliffe Hall, I had studied in SciAx. And so SciAx had a very strong academic rigor in terms of writing papers. So even when I moved to Oxford, that wasn't like a huge, the academic part wasn't a huge change. What really kind of struck me, or things that I learned in that journey, was engaging with people who are cross-culturally very different from me,
Yeah.
and even Christians.
Right.
It was mostly Europeans and a few Americans, and it was the first time I'm going out of India for such a long time and staying at a place. So engaging with Spanish Christians, Christians from Spain, Christians from Germany, and Christians from Netherlands. It was fascinating to me that there was this sense of unity, that we follow the same God, that we give our hearts to Christ, but our flavors are very different. Our thought processes are very different. The way we articulate our faith is very different. So that was a very interesting journey for me. Also, the opportunity to attend very diverse lectures and listen to, in that sense, the best in the world.
I think you've got the chance to attend a lecture by William Lane Craig, a seminar by William Lane Craig itself.
Yes.
Yeah.
You would have liked that a lot. I enjoyed it to the extent to which I understood it. But that was a very, it wasn't a session, it was just like a seminar. It was a seminar that he came for, but very popular. He's like amazingly popular there. And then along with that, Alistair McGrath, John Lennox, Swinburne. So that was a huge blessing.
So it was when you were mentioning about how when you were at Wycliffe Hall, you got to see this global Christian network there, this intercultural interaction. It came to my mind that is sort of like a very sort of like looking through a prism, getting different reflections of when we read in Scripture saying the body of Christ, how different organs and parts of the body have different functions. We normally think about it within a very local church setting, but when you think about the global church and we bring the cultural aspect, the organs, the function that they play, and their uniqueness has a very cultural taste to it as well.
Yeah.
Now, when you went to Wycliffe Hall, you were part of RZIM, but now you're part of Life Focus Society, which is a revamped, revitalized take of RZIM India here in India, brand new initiative, continuing to do what the speakers did really well, even further, even after the shift and change and all of that has happened. So what is LFS focusing into right now? What are the big projects that Life Focus Society is looking into?
Life Focus Society still continues that fervor and passion for apologetics. The main domains are, there's one main domain of the church, and engaging with the church and helping people to think more deeply about what apologetics and the questions of life and how to articulate that. So one is equipping the church. Another is corporates, looking into corporates and Christians who work in the corporate space, how they can be a shining beacon and to also understand and assimilate that world and then articulate Christ in that world. And then academia, to engage with students and the type of questions that they ask. If God is all good, why is there suffering in the world? Science and religion, these are very prominent questions that come out within the academic sphere. Apart from that, there are two main initiatives that Life Focus Society has. One is called the Culture Project. It's called Culture Unraveled. And that's particularly looking into pop culture. Movies people watch, music people listen to, the books people read, the social media trends that go on, YouTubers people follow, and to see what are the dominant themes of culture that emerge from it. So our understanding, these type of pop cultural mediums are a window into the collective psyche, are into the window into the social imagination of the people. So where is culture heading to, and how do I as a Christian who's rooted in Christ speak into the culture, understand, assimilate, and then speak into that culture? So that's the role of Culture Unraveled. Another important project is called God and the Eastern Mind, which is something that we will come to. It is, what is the best way to do apologetics here in India? How do we reframe some of those assumptions? And how do we understand Eastern thought, especially Indian thought, our own philosophical system? And what does it mean to be authentically Indian and Christian? What are some of those questions?
So, God and Eastern Minds and Culture Unraveled, these are the two projects you are specifically looking into. So, at Culture Unraveled, I've seen that you have done a spectacular work on Instagram with your super post and video responses. You've also looked into something that people normally don't look into. You've reviewed a board game. I forgot the name of the board.
Shasen.
So it is a political board game.
Yes.
So when someone reviews a movie, right, or a song or poetry or some cultural big makeshift event, we understand the reason behind it. Like you said, it gives a window, a perspective into cultural psyche, and it could very well shape cultural psyche of the audience as well. But why did you take the emphasis to review a board game? That sounded very interesting to me. Or do you think that these seemingly unimportant or um, less focused aspects of cultural psyche that give a window into perspective also can serve as a catalyst to impact culture as a whole?
That's an interesting question. I just feel like looking into our history and the Protestant history, I feel there is one positive and one negative. Let me start with the negative. I think one of the things with the Reformation that happened was we took only two particular art forms. One is music, and the other is preaching. Preaching as an art form, public rhetoric. These are the two main aspects we took, and we kind of negated architecture. We negated paintings. There's a whole load that we negated out of. And every cultural medium speaks, whether it's a painting, whether it's the aesthetics of a room, whether it's clothing, or painting, or board games. Board games are a powerful medium. So these seemingly, as you said, seemingly unimportant things have a huge impact in shaping. Say for 3 hours, 4 hours, you're playing this game. There is 7-8 people, and you're socially connected to this game.
Right.
It is rewiring your system. It is making you rethink certain assumptions of life. And so it is to kind of look into any medium that speaks. So any cultural text, anything that speaks into the world.
Right.
And in that sense, board games become a very important facet of it, along with everything else, like music, like literature. The other thing is the positive aspect of the whole Protestant movement is to take the gospel into uncharted territories, into unknown territories. And before, the missionaries did it in unknown geographical places.
Yes. Yeah.
You have these very famous missionaries going and even kind of finding out and making known places in different parts of the world which were not known.
Yeah.
So that is moving into geographically unknown spaces. But the same is true for intellectual spaces and cultural spaces.
Yes.
It is a call to move into that spaces and to be able to proclaim the gospel, to understand it, assimilate it, and proclaim. So Culture Unraveled, and as Christians, all of us, one of our tasks is to move into these kind of unknown cultural spaces and to see in what way we can engage with it. Now, having said that, it's not without its dangers.
Right.
It's not
Yeah.
without its difficulties.
Right.
But Christ hasn't called us to a safe life, where we cut ourselves off, have our own hub here, and then, I don't think that is safe also. Sooner or later, the world is going to catch up with these things. I think our call is to, as much as possible, enter into it, but do it together as a community. And if we are able to do it together as a community, it reduces the chances of error. It helps us to engage with the world in a much more holistic manner.
Yeah, and the point you mentioned about how from an earlier perspective of reaching the unreached geographically to reaching the unreached in these domains of intellectual domain and culture, it just brings a very brand new perspective of what more we can do with evangelism.
Sure.
And it just shows the workload that is left for us to achieve. It just adds on to the point of the field is plenty, the harvest is plenty, but the workers are few. But
Right.
And again, in India, right, when we look at reaching the West culturally and a person coming and trying to reach East culturally or trying to reach India with the cultural context, it is equally challenging to reach India specifically because we have cultural diasporas and distinctiveness within India itself, North, South, East, Northeast, and all of that. So it just emphasizes the fact that there is a whole lot of work still to be done, and the call for us to be very creative and unique in how we, like you said, reach the unreached, the unknown parts culturally as well.
Right.
And so with God and Eastern minds, if you were to quickly summarize the whole focus of GEM and the soul behind GEM, and then again, if you can let us know about when it began and how it began, or what was that spark that gave way to GEM?
I think the genesis of GEM started way back, I think 2016, 2017, but it really took on shape in 2018. And the main vision of it was to plug in a particular need that most of our apologetic content, the intellectual base for our apologetic content, comes to us from the West.
Right.
All right.
Yeah.
And it's framed within the cultural context of the West, whether we like it or not. And so the assumptions of the West. So the questions that emerge and then the answers to those questions that emerge. And so the whole intellectual base comes to that, and with very famous universities that is there, and very prominent apologists. So even if you have to name top apologists, all be from these
best.
particular schools of thought.
Yeah.
The GEM project was conceived with how do we reframe that and create an intellectual base for doing apologetics here. All right. Not just kind of taking those answers from there and doing it at a pop level here, but creating the academic base for it here. Engaging with the philosophical thinking here, our civilizational thinking, and then what emerges from that, the questions that emerge from that, and the answer to those questions here. So that was the thinking behind it. And if we are able to do that, we will end up being more authentic in the way in which we express our Christianity, and how we are able to kind of stand our ground. Now, having said that, as you said, it is challenging because of the heterogeneity here.
Yes.
You can't homogenize it. That's another way in which Western apologetics kind of homogenizes Eastern thought. It's pantheistic. And so it's with this blanket statement that you can say and say, Eastern thought is pantheistic. Of course, that's not true. There's monotheistic thought, there's theistic thought, there's atheistic thought. All these are different strands within the Indian philosophical system. So you can't just have blanket categories to encapsulate it. So the approach itself, how do we posture ourselves to understand the heterogeneity of religious thought here? What are the questions that emerge? And how do I, as a Christian, kind of engage with this thought here without diluting or without compromising on our faith?
So when did GEM project actually begin?
It began, if I'm not wrong, in 2018.
Okay.
It began in 2018. There was a person called Stuart McAllister who was kind of behind this project, and he's done something. So he has a lot of experience in this field. So he kind of started that off, and then so in one sense we are continuing that work. So it started off with different symposiums. Symposiums is getting PhD scholars who kind of engage with religion and different aspect of Indian philosophical and religious thought together, and brainstorming and seeing what is the methodology itself, what is the method to understand the other. What is the framework? If we use certain Protestant religious framework, then we skew other religions in order to understand it. So symposium was a gathering of that. And then we have training programs, we have literature, we have interviews, and different things in that region. Yeah.
So that's very interesting to note. And when you were mentioning about GEM, this thought came to my mind. Of the two options that I'm presenting next to you, just let me know, what is GEM more aligned or focused with? Is it about presenting Christ as an Easterner? Now, recently there's been a lot of books that have come out. I think Abdul Murray's book came out on Christianity is not a white man's religion, and so recently there has been work and literature coming out on that, and is also combating a lot of thought within the Eastern context, saying that Christianity is a white man's religion, Christ was a Westerner, sort of. It combats that. So is GEM more aligned with showing that Christ is an Easterner, or is it more concerned with showing the gospel in a very culturally relevant way in India, in the East?
That's an interesting question. It's a very thought-provoking question. I feel like one important aspect is at the eschaton, at the end of time, it is people of all languages, all cultures before the throne of God. So that means I, as an Indian who's a Christian, has something unique to offer the kingdom of God, which is us, and us as Indian Christian, that's uniquely ours, and to compromise that for a Western looking Christianity is to kind of reduce that aspect of the kingdom of God. It's to take away from there. So at first it is to kind of authentically, as an Indian and a Christian, how do we express that faith? Now, it is true that the fact that geographically, we are Christ and that culture is closer to the East than it is to the West.
Right.
There are certain nuances culturally and also in so many different forms that can help us grasp the profundity of the gospel in in a light that might be not very visible to the West, and these are certain things that emerge even in our symposium. See, even hermeneutics, hermeneutic is the science of interpretation, is the way you interpret the text. Now, if you look at the Western hermeneutic, and you follow their line from Schleiermacher and from where it is postmodern hermeneutics and so on, they in doing that, there are certain nuances of the text which will be missed.
Right.
Whereas when you bring in certain Indian philosophical thought, all right, and Indian ways of reading a text, there are certain aspects of emotion that the text brings out, which if you use an Indian hermeneutical framework, you are able to kind of appreciate that more. So I don't know whether it is to present Jesus as an Easterner or I don't think that is the direction, but it is to kind of be rooted as an Indian and as an Easterner. But how do I as an Easterner express my faith, and also kind of articulate that within within Eastern thought? How do I express my faith in a language that is palatable or understandable to the other, and so those would be some kind of question. So I know that does not particularly answer one of those categories that you mentioned, but in one sense it does not fall in any one of those categories. Okay? It is to kind of nuance it, to parse it, and to be able to kind of express it as an authentic Indian Christian.
Yeah, and as you reflect on the two options that I gave you, in one sense, when you present Christ, let's say if you were to present Christ as an Easterner, right, the gospel cannot be disjointed from Christ.
Yes.
The gospel is the good news of what Christ did. So in some sense, when you present Christ as an Easterner, then what he said is also something that becomes prima facie relevant to the Eastern context as well.
Yes.
But then, like you said, it's a nuance to work through and make sense. It just shows the complexity that comes with culture. Right. It is not something to easily wrestle with and get a grip of, and then the heterogeneity of culture in India makes it all the more difficult. Correct. Now let me ask you...
the complex theological task of doing that, even if you look at all the famous paintings of Jesus, whether it's Michelangelo or Raphael, it's all Jesus looks like an Italian thing. And so it's the complexity of capturing who Christ is, but the need for contextual relevance, the need to kind of contextualize it. So there's a theological complexity also that is there that has to be navigated well. But
and when we try to do something like the GEM approach, right, it also shows the fact that these pre-existing Western culturalization of the gospel is so ingrained in us. So if I were to see an image of Christ, and it is not the Italian, like you said, the Caucasian impression of paintings of Christ that we see, it suddenly strikes as very odd. It's like, oh, that is not the Christ painting that I know, or that is not the Christ that I've seen. It just shows how well rooted the Western cultural take on Christianity has been. But in some sense, it is also testimony of the fact of how Christianity has spread in the Western gospel. It also shows the dominance that Western advancement has had. It just meant that we became more familiar with the West because the West was everywhere, in some sense. Now, let me ask you a question that I think is the crux of this dialogue, and something that what the audience would also be asking in their mind. Why don't we present the gospel as is? Why do we engage in all of this cultural gymnastic? And if you can answer that by pointing towards some obstacle or some hurdle that the GEM approach overturns, that we wouldn't be able to overturn otherwise, I think that would give a lot of clarity to myself personally, and also I think to our audience as well.
Thanks, Jacob. I think that's a very relevant question, and thanks for pointing out and bringing that. And I'll try and articulate it as I speak. I do have an answer to it, and an important one at it. And I was recently listening to Tim Keller, and something that he says beautifully, he says, imagine you speak language A, okay, and another person speaks language B. Okay. Now you say God is love, and that's an important theological proposition, and so you say you're speaking English, God is love, and a person who speaks Hindi come to you, and you say, I need to present the truth to him as it is, and I tell him God is love. But he has no idea what it is, because he doesn't understand the language that is there. I need to be either, the two option is either he learns my language, okay, and the option is you learn my language, okay, you come to where I am, and in order to grapple this truth. Or the second option, which Tim Keller says, you learn their language, you kind of assimilate yourself, learn their language, and then you do the hard work, okay. And he says, what would Jesus do? Okay, which direction would Jesus go? The thing is, everybody inhabits a cultural space, and that cultural space forms their language of thought. Okay, and that is going to inform how they view the world and think about the world. Now we can come with our particular notions and our theological assumptions and doctrine and say, you need to come to where we are. Okay, you need to come to where we are. Let go of all your cultural assumptions and you do all the heavy lifting. All right.
Yeah.
But the Christological aspect, what the incarnation shows is that God isn't where he is and expecting people to come to where he is. It is to incarnate into that spaces. So inherent in our Christian doctrine, inherent in Christology, is the need to incarnate into these spaces, to move into these spaces and to articulate, to communicate Christ in a language that they can understand. And being in apologetics, I see this very clearly, that how Christ comes and approaches and speaks to a person in a language that they can understand. I'm not very analytical, philosophical bent as you are, all right, but I'm much more culturally and more continental philosophy based, all right. And so the way in which Christ has come to me and spoken to me, and I'm much more heart than cognitive. I'm much more emotionally driven than cognitively driven. And so the way in which Christ worked in my heart and drew me to him was in a language that I could understand.
Right.
It is very different from other people I've met. I've met this very rudimentary scientific thinker and things like that. And the way in which God approached him was through different type of evidence, DNA evidence and things like that, the fine-tuning evidence. And so God always culturally comes to us in a language that we can understand. And that's why I feel it is not diluting or compromising on the gospel when we take the effort to understand the cultural language of another and speak. Now, there is a danger of diluting it. Just like we said, whenever you encounter into a new space, because it is not tried yet, just like you, when you started SAFT and this whole endeavor, there is always a danger. There's a danger of you kind of misrepresenting or misappropriating or overusing certain of your own assumption. But it's still a risk that you feel is willing to take for the cause of Christ. It's a hard work that you're willing to put into factoring in the dangers that is there. And so it isn't gymnastics, but there is work that is involved. But I feel like that is a work that we are called to because Christ is the God that we are following. And inherent in Christology is speaking the gospel in a language that people can understand.
Wow. Yeah. And as you were mentioning about it, I just reflect on the fact that there is a danger to the initiative and effort that we take. And it is something that comes with us as humans. We say to err, he's human.
Yes.
But then we can't point towards a possible error that could happen and not venture to avoid that error.
Correct.
The best way is to venture into that. And then this is a spiritual endeavor. This is not a merely intellectual human endeavor.
Yes.
So it is also trusting in God to lead and guide us. And any initiative that we take spiritually, any initiative that we take that has to do with presenting the gospel, as humans, we are going to falter someplace. But we can't point towards the possible errors that GEM approach or a cultural apologetics approach could possibly fall into, and then say, okay, then I dare not touch into it at all. Maybe for some people, if they don't feel like this is a space that they're called into, makes sense. Absolutely makes sense to not venture into. But then there is a great relevance to venture into that and explore and break through those cultural barriers and present the gospel in that context.
Right.
Because God never I don't think God speaks in a vacuum to anyone.
Right.
It is always like you mentioned about where we are placed in our background experience, our personal experience, all of that is spoken into.
Right. It's an interesting aspect that you brought out. Yes, there is the work of the Holy Spirit that is there at work here. So it's not a human effort move into it. It's God who is moving us into these spaces, and it is His Spirit that moves us into this space, and that's an important dimension that we hold on to and we have to hold on to. So
next up, I have something that in mind that you touched upon it briefly right now in your answer, but I just wanted to flesh out that answer clearly. There are two verses coming in my mind. John 3:16, for God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whoever believes in Him shall not perish, but shall have eternal life. And then John 17 verse 3, which says, and this is eternal life, that they may know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent. So is the GEM approach limited to making the core of the gospel? These verses capture the very simple core of the gospel. So is the GEM approach limited to presenting the core of the gospel in a culturally relevant way? Or does the GEM approach, and again the GEM project or anything of that sort, does it venture into deep theological topics like the Trinity or the study of salvation, soteriology, or anything of that sort?
I think the beauty of the gospel is it has an simplicity to it. It has a very direct simplicity to it, but it has a deep profoundness and depth to it, such that people of the likes of Augustine and Thomas Aquinas and Blaise Pascal is breaking their minds to understand the profundity of the gospel.
Yeah.
But at the same time, much more simplistic people like John Bunyan, or even people who work for me. My maid is a Christian. She's not very sophisticated, but for her, it's a real dynamic faith. So there is an aspect where the gospel, there is a simple element to the gospel, but it's deeply profound. All right. And so the task of theology is to, in one sense, it's not to unnecessarily make it complex,
Right.
but it is to grapple with the complexity of it. See, my car is kind of simple for me. I just have to get in, I have to change the gear, press it, and then move. But that is, I can simply use it, but there is a whole engine system, there's a whole fabrication system, there's a whole complexity that holds this simple thing that I am doing. So there is a whole deeper, complex, nuanced space in it. And people who are kind of have the privilege to kind of study and understand and kind of grapple with the complexity of it should. Now, should everybody do it? No, because God has called different people for different vocation.
Yeah.
I'm privileged because I have the opportunity to kind of study, and then it's not I have a full-time job and this is a part-time thing that somehow even what the monetary expenses for it, I'm able to make a living out of it and kind of focus on this particularly. And so it isn't to get into the whole theological doctrines of the Trinity and soteriology, but that is an important component of it. How does an Easterner look at salvation? What is moksha?
Yeah.
What is liberation? Where does it come from? How do they look at life like this? What are the texts from which this thought of kind of emerges from? How did the Bhakti traditions or how did other traditions kind of re-understand it, re-look at it? And what is, how do we understand salvation as spoken within the biblical language? And then how do you make this connection? So definitely there is a level of complexity to it, but that is at one level. How do we kind of translate that in a manner that is more palatable and more simplistic for people to understand? That's another translation in of itself, And in one sense, apologetics has done that. If when you look into the rise or the way in which apologetics has moved, it was a discipline which was only done within academic sphere, only this group of philosophers or these great thinkers who kind of wrestle with it within universities. But now it is even lay Christians, it infiltrates into the life of the church. So it's not just an elite discipline. It is done by different people on different levels based on what privilege and what time and effort they can put into it. So I feel the same for this project also. To have different layers to it, it is to have a sound academic base for it, where you wrestle with the complexities of it, questions of Trinity, questions of soteriology, questions of the text, but also then finally move to the simplest form of it. How do we extrapolate the simplest form of it and be able to simplistically articulate it? So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, and I'm so very much enjoying this conversation. Like, I think this is the second or third time that we are actually meeting and conversing, and every conversation with you has been really riveting and so insightful. Coming back to the Culture Unraveled project that you do, you are looking towards an Instagram audience, right? And this is, so my friend Lucas Rueger of Deflate, when he came on the podcast, he was mentioning about the global youth culture. And what he was saying about was this, how is this Western culture is permeating across cultural fabrics, and it is creating a global youth culture that is very much global.
Right.
So how relevant and effective is the GEM approach to a young audience base in India, that is Netflix binging, reel scrolling, hashtag popping?
That's a very relevant question, and it's a very interesting question. One of my very good friends, Joshua, one of his PhD, what he's doing his PhD on is like generational culture. Like each generation has a particular culture, so it's not just your geographical region,
Right.
but depending on which generation that you are, they have a particular culture that is there. Millennials always tend to keep their phones on silent, whereas baby boomers would. I mean, that's not their phone is always on. So there are many different cultural differences, and you can large scale understand understand it by which generation that you are, whether you're Gen Z or millennial and stuff like that. Now, having said that, what GEM takes very seriously is that we are all inhabit a civilization, whichever civilization that we come from. And so there is a civilizational aspect here. There's a civilizational culture. So yes, we are moving to a globalized world, which is, but having said that, see, there is certain commonalities that you would find with people of that particular generation. What the GEM takes seriously is the fact that, see, even I as an Indian who's looking at a Western Netflix movie will analyze it very differently from a Westerner who is watching of the same age group. So we are watching the same cultural text that is there. You're watching the same movie, but your way of analysis will be different. It will not be the same. And that's a nuance that we have to understand. So even if any product that comes here and it's hitting at millennials and Gen Z, the way in which they would advertise it here would be very different when they would advertise it in, say, Africa or Australia and things like that. So
and that's very relevant from the normal commercial advertisements also that we see.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. So there is a difference. So there is a commonality that you can find. So there are traces that you can find. There are certain elements of commonality, but there is aspects of difference. And that difference comes from the fact that we inhabit a different civilization. We come from a different civilization, and India has its nuances and particularities. So in that sense, GEM is really important because it does not make the world flat. It does not say all millennials are like this.
Right.
It at least tries to put, yes, there are commonalities with these generations, but it's very different. There are also aspects that are very different, and these differences will play itself out based on our history, our social history, our national history, and our politics, and what we have, the language that we speak. The fact that we are from Kerala and we speak Malayalam, that itself informs the way in which we look at the world, our thought processes that is there. So even though there is commonalities, those deep differences have to be understood and spoken to. So
wow. And if I were to pinpoint this dialogue towards one specific area, we're talking about apologetics. This is an apologetics channel. You do apologetics. Normally, when we come to an apologetics specific question or objection, right? What we do is we go in and consume content that is meant for the Western audience. Like you said, it's created by some of the big names in the Western world, in the Western culture. How would you bring the GEM approach to answer a common apologetics question, which we normally turn to the West to inform us to give the answer to? Is there an example that you can highlight to bring it out?
Oh, that's an excellent question. I think one thing is to even reframe the questions itself. So we take certain questions as, okay, these are the questions out there, and then we find answers which have been given by these heavyweight figures. But maybe those questions are not the questions that people are asking here. People are thinking about very different questions. So it is also to reframe those questions. Now, definitely there are certain questions which are universal, which remains the same. If God is all good, why is there suffering in this world? And the whole science and religion question is, the world has moved towards a more objective scientific inquiry of the nature of things. So those questions are, especially within the secular audience, within a middle class, upper middle class, educated audience, some of those questions remain the same. But apart from that, it is to also kind of rethink what are the real questions that emerge. And these are not very, people do not have articulate conceptions of their questions itself. Right. It's just there in their mind. They haven't articulated, because it takes a lot for these questions to kind of come up and then be able to kind of articulate those questions. So the project even looks at what are some questions that we haven't even looked into. See, the Indian way of looking at the world is much more in terms of myths, epics, and narratives. You have the great Indian myths, you have the great Indian, whereas a Judeo-Christian worldview is historically grounded. So the question, so is the Western worldview is a lot more historical grounded. Whereas in India we feel like a notion is that myth is more important than history because history only happens once. So but myth can happen every time. There's a possibility of myths happening every time. So it's a very different world altogether.
Yeah.
And so how do you engage mythic civilization and these mythic stories that come with the historical narrative of the Judeo-Christian faith? What are the commonalities here? How do we build this bridge? And even when you look into the Bible, it isn't the type of history, or it isn't saying the type of history that maybe the Western biographical way of looking at history also. So there also it is much more nuanced. There's a deep metaphorical, symbolic aspects to it. Of course, there is a historical reality that is connected to it, but it's not the type of objective type of history that
we're normally familiar with.
Which we are normally familiar with. There are these kind of grand narratives that are there embedded within the Jewish literature and Jewish cosmology. So there's a mythical element to it. So I think those things can be nourished, when we engage with Eastern thought.
And on a note, at our recently published SAFT blog, we'll drop a link in the description. Check out blog.saftapologetics.com. In there, we're recently working on bringing out a new series of articles with Bobby at LFS, and where Bobby is going to look at, and the ideas we're working on it, Bobby is going to look at how women are understood and perceived and their role presented in Indian mythology. And we're going to contrast that with his article, with an article from one of our friends at SciAx, who's going to present how women are seen in the Old Testament. And that just, it captures one of the apologetics question, okay? Right. Woman in the Bible. And we present the same answer, right? When our friend at SciAx is going to write on the woman in the Bible, she is not going to write the greatest, most unbelievably unique response that maybe it may come about. Right. But even if a response is just an agglomeration of the existing literature out there, by bringing in a perspective from the East to show, okay, this is how it is seen in Indian mythology. Now contrast that with the Bible. It hits the Indian mind very differently. It hits the mind very uniquely.
That's very interesting, especially with the difficulty in understanding gender and gender roles and how do we understand gender? And I think these can really kind of engage that discussion, or at least bring a particular light into this kind of discussion, which might be missed out otherwise. So
and along the same line of the apologetics questions and arguments that are relevant to the Indian audience, I think we are a long way from the future where the general Indian audience will ask, please explain to me the Leibnizian cosmological argument, why there is something instead of nothing. It may strike some of us who are more nuanced in that direction, but a lot of people, the question of evil is still going to be the more relevant question to grapple with, or the question of the reliability of the Gospels. So that also, understanding our culture and our audience is going to make us more effective in that sense. Else you're just going to speak to the wrong audience with a brilliant stuff. Right. Content is going to be really great, but you're just speaking to the wrong audience.
Right.
And with the burden of task and the work to be completed, we really don't want to be firing at the wrong audience, the wrong target. We want to be articulate and specific in what we contribute towards. Right. And we're coming to the end of this very fascinating discussion. So is there anything else that you want the audience to know more about GEM? Anything else that we wouldn't have captured in this dialogue? And also, to someone who's listening to this dialogue and feels, I feel really excited about GEM, I want to apply the GEM approach or be more connected with the God and Eastern Minds project, what would be some other steps, if there are any, that you would suggest to them?
I think there are different ways to connect. Is one, maybe to write a comment in this description below. I'm sure there's a way in which they know how to get in touch with you. The audience can get in touch with you. They can really get in touch with you. And so there are different, we have an e-magazine coming out. We want to kind of equip those who are interested in this endeavor with the resources and material, categories of understanding, frameworks of understanding, calling them for training programs, writing literature on it and exchanging. So there's a different ways in which we also have like an online talk once a month where we kind of bring experts from different fields and who speak into it. And just to address something I was thinking while you were speaking, see, even what your cosmological argument or arguments for causality and things like that, see, even that can be furnished a lot by looking into our philosophical system. So even within the 6 orthodox schools of Indian tradition, they have also Jamini has spoken a lot about causality and how to look at causality. but it has their internal rationality and internal coherence to it, and so there could also be need for Indian apologists who kind of speak within the analytical philosophical tradition, but kind of how do we juxtapose this language into that, or how can this shed a light into that? Os Guinness says that comparison is the mother of clarity. That when you bring these variables in, it is able to shine a light which would have been dark otherwise. So, but when you compare it, so the task of a Christian is also that when we engage authentically with these other traditions, as much as we are able to articulate our faith more clearly there, it also shines a light into our own. And we are able to go deeper into us. To give an example of Peter and Cornelius, Peter's engagement with Cornelius, who's the other, also helps him understand a deeper dimension of who Christ is.
Right.
So there is an element where some things which we did not think about, or the depth of Christian faith and Christian theology, which we were not fully which we did not fully understand, or certain things which we were blinded to, could be illuminated in our encounter with it. So it works on variable levels. It works on various levels that is there. But again, it requires people who are kind of interested in it. It also requires a way in which we kind of reframe our thinking and push into it. So,
wow, splendid. That's a great place to come to the conclusion of this most exciting and insightful episode. And I think the conversation that we've had right now, previously also when we met off record, and one that we've had on record, I think it's really shown some very brand new light in every sense of the word to what we can do as a ministry to reach the Indian audience with our desire and vision to break the language barrier and reach apologetics in the Indian continent. That just brings a lot of perspective. And we have some more announcements for our audience, so do stick around. Once again, Jacob, thank you so much for being on this podcast.
Thanks for being so open to collaboration and to working on it, and I feel like that is definitely needed, for organizations to collaborate, for different apologetics with different flavors to collaborate. And the fact that you do it and are open to doing it with very different organizations, I feel that's amazing. So thanks so much for this.
I was just reflecting back on how SAFT Podcast began, like our first guest recording. It was in 2019, the end of 2019. And I remember I had just a phone and an earphone with me. I snuck into the 10th floor of my hostel, sat by the staircase at the close to midnight, and was recording the first guest recording on the podcast with Briar Onton. And from there, we have reached till here as a ministry. And it is nothing but to say that this is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. I'm always reminded of the words of Hudson Taylor: God's work done in God's way will never lack God's supplies. And a big thank you to every one of us who have been in this journey with us so far. A special shout out to our friend Matt, who helped us with the technicalities and the camera. To all of our friends and families who've been with us all along, so long. Our team members at SAFT, our board members, thank you so much for all the support and passion that you have poured into the ministry. Unfortunately, all good things must come to an end. And this is the end of SAFT Podcast Season 4. We're going to take a short sabbatical and we'll be back with Season 5. And as we're looking to expand with more content, by the next time we come back with Season 5, you will be hopefully seeing more nuanced, brand new video content from SAFT Apologetics, not just from the podcast base. And in terms of some other updates as well to share, our SAFT speaking team is always available to step into any speaking opportunity that your church or ministry wants to provide. Our speaking team consists of economics, MBBS and law students, and we are all within the age of 23 to 24. So we believe that God has placed us in a very unique time and space to reach to a very young audience, a very diverse audience because of our educational background. And we hope and pray that the Lord would move in your hearts to make our resources freely available to you in your church and organizational setting. And do send in your questions to us. Reach out to us at SAFT Podcast at saftapologetics.com or info@saftapologetics.com, or send in your answers as an audio recording through SpeakPipe, which is there in the description, and we will be more than happy to feature your questions. So until we see you in the next episode of SAFT Podcast, we wish you once again a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to you, Jacob.
And you too.
Take care, everyone. God bless.